By the third night of the Whitehorn blizzard, Redwash Basin had vanished. Wind tore across the flats at more than 60 miles an hour. The cold had fallen to 29 below. Snow buried fence posts and erased the line between earth and sky. At Coldwater Reach, one section of the willow windbreak snapped loose. Harlan Vexley tied a rope around his waist and placed the other end in Mara Bellwether's hands. If the wall failed, wind would strike the offset barn entrance and pack the doorway shut. Inside, Eli counted marker posts through the whiteout. Nell cried behind the canvas curtain, a milk cow strained in early labor. Noah Pike, the hand who had mocked Harlan's work, lay exhausted beside the stove. The rope jerked once, then nothing. 6 weeks earlier, Harlan had stumbled onto this property with a single plea, a little milk for his child. How is it that now the survival of the whole ranch rested on his ability to keep standing? Late in September of 1887, Harlan Vexley reached Coldwater Reach with nothing but an old handcart and 2 children. He was only 39, yet the trail had already aged him. His coat had been patched with 2 different kinds of cloth. One hand pulled the cart, the other carried 10-month-old Nell against his shoulder. 7-year-old Eli walked beside the wheel without asking how much farther they had to go. Harlan had spent years repairing barns, freight wagons, hand pumps, and storage sheds along Union Pacific supply stations. After his wife, Lydia, died from childbed fever, he could no longer travel with a repair crew while raising 2 children alone. 3 ranches had already turned him away. One offered work but refused the children. Another gave them a bed for one night before sending them back onto the road. A third suggested that Nell would be better off with another family. Harlan walked away. On their last day before reaching the ranch, Nell could only be calmed with thin-grain porridge. Eli quietly tucked half his cornbread deep inside his coat, even after his father promised there would be food tomorrow. Harlan saw it and understood the truth. The boy no longer believed in tomorrow. Then Coldwater Reach appeared beyond a wind-scoured rise. The barn roof sagged. Its main doors faced the northwest wind. An old willow row stood too close and half dead. Smoke streamed sideways from the chimney. But inside the corral, milk cows were still standing. Mara Bellwether, the widowed owner of Coldwater Reach Ranch, stood beside the stock trough, breaking a thin sheet of early ice with the back of a hammer. It was far too early in the season for water to freeze. She watched the stranger and the 2 children before asking a single question. Her sleeves were rolled above her elbows. A feed ledger rested beneath her belt. One leather glove had been worn smooth by years of holding reins. Nothing about her suggested someone waiting to be rescued. "What kind of work do you know?" she asked. Harlan answered without offering his story. Barn frames, hand pumps, water troughs, wagon wheels, roofs, doors, hay storage. "And what do you need?" His eyes settled on Nell, who quietly chewed the corner of her blanket because hunger had lasted longer than tears. "Give my kids milk. Let us sleep somewhere out of the wind. I'll fix what winter is about to break." Mara glanced toward her barn. "What makes you think anything is broken?" Harlan raised one hand toward the buildings beyond the fence. "Your barn doors face the northwest wind. Your hay is pulling moisture from the ground. That water line will freeze before the first real cold front." Silence settled between them. Confidence was easy to find on the frontier. Proof was not. Mara looked at Eli. Then she looked at Nell, still resting against Harlan's shoulder. She stepped forward without answering his claims. Instead, she gently lifted the little girl from his trembling arms. "The milk comes first," she said quietly. "Your claims can wait until morning." Mara led them into the kitchen without another question. She warmed fresh cow's milk with a little water, tested it against the inside of her wrist, then nodded toward Harlan. "Slowly," she said. "Her stomach has been empty too long." A bowl of beef, stew, cornbread, and dried apples appeared in front of Eli. Another bowl waited for Harlan, even after he quietly insisted he was not hungry. Eli ate without speaking. Before finishing, he secretly pocketed his leftover bread. Mara noticed. She said nothing. Instead, she laid another piece beside his bowl as though it had always belonged there. Across the table, Harlan tried to feed Nell, but his hands trembled from exhaustion. Mara reached forward and steadied the bottom of the cup without taking the little girl from his arms. Between quiet bites, they exchanged only the facts that mattered. Lydia had died 6 months earlier from childbed fever. Calder Bellwether, Mara's late husband and the ranch's former builder, had been killed 3 winters earlier when a logging wagon slid from an icy mountain road. Mara had never had children. Coldwater Reach was carrying debt after losing 9 head of cattle the previous winter. Later that evening, Mara opened the old foreman's room. From a storage loft she carried down a cradle. Calder had started years before. One rail was still rough, never sanded smooth. Harlan noticed she had kept it all this time instead of burning it for firewood. That night, Nell slept peacefully in the unfinished cradle. Eli fell asleep, his hand still tightly guarding the hoarded bread in his pocket. Before sunrise, Harlan was already walking the entire ranch. He did not pick up a hammer. He did not move a single board. He watched first. A short piece of wool hung beside the barn door, showing him how the wind curled through the opening. He dug into the floor beneath the haystack with a shovel and found damp earth beneath the bottom layer. He poured water into one section of the trough and watched how slowly it drained away. Inside the house, a thin line of frost clung to the shrinking chinking between the logs. Outside, old ridges of hardened snow still rested against the fence where the previous winter had piled them. Mara followed without announcing herself. When Harlan finally spoke, he pointed instead of waving his hands. The barn isn't losing heat because it needs thicker walls. It's losing heat because the wind walks straight through the doors. He knelt beside the hay. This stack is spoiling from the bottom up. Then he pointed toward the pump. The water line is too shallow. It has nowhere to drain after use. His hand rested against the wall of the house. The chinking has pulled away from the logs. Finally, he looked toward the dying row of willow. Those trees are too close. Last winter the snow drifted exactly where you needed an open doorway. Mara folded her arms. Calder planted those willows. Harlan shook his head. He wasn't wrong. She looked at him, surprised. They work against spring winds, he continued. Winter storms come from a different direction. The trees stayed the same. The weather didn't. Some of the tension left her face. Harlan looked across the ranch one more time. 6 weeks, he said. Water first, hay second, then the windbreak, the offset entrance. Fresh. Chinking, marker posts before the first storm. Mara studied him for a long moment before pointing toward the tool shed. You get 1 week, she said. Then I'll decide whether you see problems or invent them. Harlan began with the jobs least likely to start an argument. The hay came first. Together, he, Mara, and Eli lifted away the bottom layers of the stack. A sour smell rose from beneath. Several patches felt warm and damp, where moisture had been trapped against the ground. Harlan built a raised crib 8 inches high from old pine rails, already lying behind the shed. Instead of stacking the hay into one large mound again, he divided it into smaller sections and left narrow air channels between them. Eli's job was simple. 8 inches, Harlan said. The boy measured each gap with a short piece of wood and counted every space out loud. It was the most words he had spoken since arriving at the ranch. Next came the water line. Harlan opened a test trench and found the pipe buried only a little deeper than 2 feet. It should be 4 feet, 8 inches here, he said, and it needs enough fall to empty itself after every use. Mara studied the trench. We don't have time to dig the whole line. Then we don't, Harlan answered. We protect the stretch between the well and the milk cows first. There was no argument. only a shorter plan. Late that afternoon, Ruth Fenley, an elderly neighboring ranch widow who quietly watched over families across the basin, stopped by with fresh goat's milk and quiet news. Silas Greeley has been asking about Mara's new man. Nobody answered. As Ruth set 2 loaves of bread on the table, she noticed the bread Eli had saved peeking out of his pocket. She looked toward Mara. "Should I leave 1 loaf?" Mara shook her head. "Leave 2. That evening, Harlan handed Mara a short list. Every item that could be reused had been marked first. Everything that truly needed buying came last. By the 3rd day, stakes marked the outline of Harlan's new windbreak across the open ground. It would stand 34 feet northwest of the barn, not in front of it, not against it. Far enough to weaken the wind before it reached the buildings. The frame would form an L shape. At its tallest point, it would rise 7 feet, 4 inches. Lodgepole pine would carry the weight. Willow branches would be woven between the posts, but never tightly enough to stop every gust. Sod and brush would anchor the base. The shorter arm would shield the path between the house and the barn. Harlan and Eli were driving another post when a horse stopped beside the fence. Silas Greeley, the largest ranch owner in Red Wash Basin and Mara's longtime rival, climbed down without greeting anyone. Years earlier, after Calder Bellwether died, Silas had offered to buy Coldwater Reach for a price Mara had refused. Ever since then, he had spoken about the ranch as though its failure were only a matter of time. He looked over the growing frame and smiled. "So this is Vexley's willow wall." His boot nudged one of the posts. "All it'll do is catch snow and bury your barn." Harlan rested both hands on the post driver. "If I build it too close..." "You're right." Silas frowned. "If. The distance matters more than the wall." Silas turned toward Mara. "Since when did a drifter become your engineer?" Mara never looked away from the survey stakes. "He is not a drifter," she said calmly. "He is my foreman until the work proves otherwise." The words surprised everyone. Even Harlan. Silas let out a quiet laugh. "You'll still need my freight road once winter closes in. If you have business to discuss," Mara replied, "put it in writing." Silas climbed back into the saddle. As he gathered the reins, he looked once more at the unfinished wall. "Winter will decide which one of us is wasting time." He rode away without another word. Eli watched until the horse disappeared over the rise. Then he looked up at his father. "What if he's right?" Harlan picked up the next willow pole. "Then we'll change it before the snow does." The first hard squall arrived sooner than anyone expected. Harlan tied narrow strips of cloth to the willow posts before the wind reached the ranch. He wanted to see how the air actually moved instead of guessing. The answer came within minutes. The center of the windbreak was too tight. The wind climbed over it, rolled downward, and slammed into the ground behind the wall. Thin snow and dry grass began drifting toward the barn entrance. One woven willow panel snapped loose. An old milk cow balked at the temporary passage and nearly tore a hinge from the gate. Far across the basin, 2 of Silas Greeley's hands stopped their wagon long enough to watch. Harlan never defended the mistake. He cut away nearly 1/5 of the willow from the middle section. Mara studied the moving cloth strips for a moment. "Try weaving the next pieces on a diagonal," she said. "Let the wind spread instead of fighting one flat wall." They worked until sunset. When the next gust came, it passed through the willow, slowed, and lost its force before reaching the barn. Harlan nodded toward the fluttering cloth. A windbreak that stops everything becomes another cliff. The wind only needs to lose its strength. The offset entrance revealed another flaw. The turn was too sharp, and the old cow refused the dark corner. Mara measured the passage with her eyes. "We widen it." They moved the gate, opened the angle, and hung a lantern where the shadows had frightened the cattle. As darkness settled over Coldwater Reach, Mara handed Harlan the willow cutters. "Your wall," she said. She looked at the cloth still dancing in the evening wind. My wind. Then she smiled. Just enough to be noticed. We fixed both. A week later, Edwin March, the county livestock inspector, rode into Coldwater Reach after hearing that Mara was rebuilding her barn before winter. He never laughed. Instead, he asked difficult questions. A tighter barn can trap moisture. Deep bedding can build ammonia. A hay crib can heat from the inside if the air doesn't move. A homemade water line can pull dirt back into the trough. That canvas curtain is safe only if it stays clear of the stove. Harlan listened without interrupting. Together they checked the ridge vent, tested the bedding by hand, measured the warmth inside the haystack, inspected the distance between the canvas and the stovepipe, and examined the drain valve beneath the water line. Before leaving, March made one request. Keep records for 3 weeks. Morning and evening temperatures. Firewood used. Hay fed. Barn moisture. Every time you break ice. Mara hung a ledger beside the kitchen door. March pointed toward the pipe where it passed through the wall. That section could become a cold bridge. I'll box it with dry wool and wood, Harlan replied. March nodded once. I don't believe your system will work. Harlan answered without offense. You should not. He looked toward the unfinished ranch. Not until it does. Mara handed a pencil to Eli. Write today's numbers, she said. The boy carefully marked the first line in the ledger. From that morning on, facts would speak before opinions ever could. But before the numbers could prove anything, the cold spoke first with a practical test. The first batch of chinking failed. Harlan had mixed too much clay into the mortar. After 2 cold nights, the fresh seams shrank away from the logs. Fine cracks appeared. A strip of wool held against the wall still fluttered in the draft. Without complaint, Harlan reached for his scraper. We start over. Mara stopped him. My father used to seal sheep sheds, she said. Calder learned from him. Less clay, more animal hair, more rye straw. Scratch the first layer before finishing the second. Harlan nodded. They mixed another batch. This one gripped the logs instead of pulling away. Later, while searching the storage loft, Harlan found an old canvas roll. The leather stitching along its edges was still intact. Lydia made this, he said quietly. We used it as a draft curtain in a freight camp. He started measuring where to cut it. You don't have to, Mara said. Together they hung the entire canvas between the sleeping room and the main room without removing a single stitch. As they worked, Harlan spoke of Lydia for the first time. She never feared the cold, but she always checked a child's wrist before she checked the fire. She could sew a tighter leather seal than most men could build with wood. Mara smiled faintly. Calder always set 2 tin cups beside the stove every morning. The next morning, 2 cups stood there again. Neither of them mentioned why. That evening, the room held its warmth far longer than before. Harlan rested his hand on Lydia's old leather stitching for a moment, then quietly let it go. The canvas stayed exactly where it belonged. The rhythm of the ranch slowly settled into something steady. While Harlan worked with both hands outdoors, Mara cared for Nell without ceremony. She warmed milk, changed blankets, walked slow circles around the stove when the little girl grew restless. Before long, she could tell the difference between a cry for warmth and a cry for food. At first, she held the baby too stiffly. Then something changed. Nell stopped crying when she heard Mara's boots crossing the floor. Tiny fingers reached for the collar of Mara's coat. More than once, she fell asleep on Mara's shoulder while Mara recorded hay and firewood in the ledger with a pencil still in her free hand. One evening, Harlan stepped inside and found them standing exactly that way. He reached for Nell. Mara gave the smallest shake of her head. She just fell asleep. Harlan simply laid his dry gloves beside the stove where Mara could warm her hands later, then walked back outside to check the trough. On another afternoon, Eli helped shell dry beans into a wooden bowl. After a long silence, he looked up. "Why don't you have children?" Mara smiled without looking away from her hands. "Some rooms are built and never filled." Eli glanced toward the unfinished cradle where Nell slept. "That one is filled now." Mara said nothing. The next morning, Harlan noticed something he had been hoping to see for weeks. The usual leftover cornbread now sat untouched on the table. For the first time since Lydia died, Eli had gone to sleep, believing it would still be there tomorrow. The first real cold snap arrived before anyone expected it. By sunrise, the temperature had fallen to 12 degrees above zero. It was the first honest test of everything they had built. The old barn had once struggled to stay above 19 degrees, with cold drafts crossing the floor all day. Now, behind the willow windbreak and the offset entrance, the milk barn held between 30 and 33 degrees whenever the inner doors stayed closed. The house burned only 5 armloads of firewood instead of 7. The bedding stayed dry. The hay beneath the raised crib smelled clean instead of sour. Then the water stopped. The buried line remained open, but the metal coupling beside the trough froze solid. Edwin March had been right. The pipe where it crossed into the open air had become a cold bridge. Harlan grabbed an axe and broke the ice away. "I missed it." There was no excuse in his voice. Together, he and Mara lowered the drain valve, built a small wooden box around the coupling, packed it with dry wool waste, wrapped the outside in tarred cloth, and left enough airspace to keep moisture from collecting inside. They worked until nearly midnight. Mara walked out carrying 2 tin cups filled with hot chicory coffee. Harlan accepted one without lifting his eyes. "I said I'd fix this ranch." "You did. The water still froze." Mara blew across the steam before taking a sip. "You promised to fix it," she said quietly. "You never promised to guess right the first time." The words stayed with him longer than the coffee. The next morning, they filled the trough again. The water flowed. When the cattle finished drinking, the line emptied itself exactly as planned. For the first time, Harlan understood something that had nothing to do with pipes or winter. Mara was not measuring him by whether he ever failed. She was measuring him by whether he stayed until the failure was gone. For 3 weeks, the ledger filled one careful line at a time. Every morning, Eli wrote down the temperature. Mara added the armloads of firewood, the hay fed to the cattle, the milk collected, the moisture inside the bedding, and every time the trough needed breaking. The numbers slowly formed their own argument. Nearly 2 fewer armloads of wood disappeared on cold days. Hay use dropped almost 20%. Milk stayed steady. Since the water line had been repaired, the trough had not frozen once. Edwin March returned and read every page before closing the ledger. "I wouldn't call it proven," he said, "but it's doing exactly what it should." Later that afternoon, Silas Greeley rode in. "When the snow comes," he said, "my freight road closes unless you sign spring water rights over to my herd." "No," Mara answered. Silas shrugged. "A few cold nights aren't winter." Harlan said nothing. After Silas rode away, he asked only one question. "How many days of hay if his road stays closed?" 19 by the old numbers, Mara replied. "Longer if the ledger is right." Harlan studied the gray sky. "We prepare for 26. Without another word, Mara opened the ledger, wrote 26 beneath the last entry, and drew a single line beneath it. From that moment forward, the ranch would prepare for the winter they hoped would never come. The sky began changing 3 days before the storm arrived. At noon, Juniper turned her back to the northwest wind and refused to graze. The air grew heavy. Low clouds stretched across the basin in long gray bands. Just before sunset, the wind died without warning. The birds disappeared. Harlan and Mara stopped talking about improvements. Now they prepared for survival. Marker posts went into the ground every 18 feet. The cistern was filled to the top. Hay was moved closer to the barn while keeping the air channels open. Every rope on the willow windbreak was checked again. The milk cows and young calves were moved into the protected section. Extra lanterns were hung inside the offset entrance. A guide rope was tied from the house to the barn. A repair bag waited beside the door. Eli watched the last marker post disappear into the frozen ground. Why do we need both the rope and the posts? Harlan tightened another knot. A rope keeps a man from drifting. Posts tell him whether he's still going somewhere. While searching the shed, Mara found an old stake bearing Calder's hand-cut mark. She carried it to the first position nearest the house. Harlan quietly reinforced the repair bag with a leather strap Lydia had sewn years before. Nothing useful was left behind. That evening, Ruth Fenley stopped on her way south to stay with relatives until the storm passed. She left fresh goat's milk on the table. Her eyes paused on the 2 tin cups beside the stove, but she said nothing. Near dusk, a written warning arrived from Edwin March. An Arctic front was pushing south. Winds could exceed 60 miles an hour. Once the snow began, no one should leave shelter. Everything that could be prepared had been prepared. Now the ranch would wait for the only judge that mattered. The Whitehorn blizzard arrived before dawn. The first blast came from the northwest, exactly as Harlan had predicted. The willow windbreak bent but held. Snow gathered where it was supposed to, well away from the barn doors. The offset entrance broke the direct force of the wind before it reached the cattle. The cistern stayed open beneath its cover. The trough filled, then drained itself before the pipe could freeze. Behind Lydia's canvas curtain, the children's sleeping room held its warmth. Harlan and Mara crossed between the house and the barn one at a time, clipped to the guide rope. By midday, one marker post disappeared beneath drifting snow. The next one still showed its fluttering strip of cloth. Late that afternoon, a dull pounding echoed beyond the windbreak. Harlan followed the line of posts into the white darkness. He found Noah Pike half buried beside the next marker. The horse was gone. His cheeks were white with frostbite. He had lost Silas Greeley's crew hours earlier. "I saw the cloth," Noah whispered. "That's why I kept walking." Harlan brought him inside without saying another word. When Noah woke beside the stove, he spoke between slow breaths. "Silas's north barn. Winds blowing straight through it. The cattle are packed into one corner. They're still trying to reach water." No one answered. Noah looked up at the canvas hanging between the rooms. Only days earlier, he had laughed at Vexley's willow wall. Now that same system had carried him home. The storm tightened its grip overnight. The temperature fell even lower. Before sunrise, Maple, the oldest milk cow, went into labor weeks too early. Mara took one look and knew something was wrong. The calf was turned. Dr. Amos Keene, the country veterinarian who served ranches across Red Wash Basin, could not reach the ranch. Snow had buried every road. There would be no help beyond the people already inside the barn. While Harlan checked the water line and the windbreak, Mara washed her hands with warm water, tied Maple's tail aside, found the calf's front legs, and worked slowly with the boiled calving straps, exactly as Amos had once shown her. Eli held the lantern. His hands shook. "Look at her eyes," Mara said softly. He obeyed. Harlan returned just as the final pull was needed. The calf slid onto the dry straw. It did not breathe. Mara cleared its mouth. Harlan rubbed its ribs with clean straw. Without being asked, Eli placed a dry towel into Mara's hand. For one long moment, nothing happened. Then the calf drew its first breath. Everyone stopped moving. From the house, Nell began to cry. Still weak from the day before, Noah pulled the unfinished cradle closer to the stove and quietly warmed another bottle of milk. No one stood outside the work anymore. The dry bedding kept the newborn off the frozen floor. The offset entrance held the wind outside the calving stall. Running water made clean hands possible. The lantern hanging in the widened passage kept the cattle calm. Eli finally let out the breath he had been holding since the calf had fallen into the straw. The third day brought the hardest wind. Just after noon, one of the lashings on the north section of the willow windbreak snapped. The woven panel shook violently. If it failed, the wind would pour straight through the offset passage. Snow would bury the barn entrance. Within hours, the cattle could be sealed inside. Harlan reached for the rope. Mara caught the other end without a word. Outside, the storm erased everything beyond the next marker post. Harlan crawled from stake to stake. One post had already snapped. The loose willow lattice slammed into him, knocking him flat into the snow. His repair bag burst open. Tools scattered across the drift. Only Lydia's old leather strap kept the bag from blowing away. Inside the barn, Maple bellowed. Nell cried from the house. Mara gripped the rope with both hands. Then she felt 3 sharp tugs. Their signal. Give line. She fed more rope into the storm. Harlan reached the broken section and braced it with a spare willow pole, setting it across the frame instead of rebuilding the wall. It did not need to last forever. Only until morning. The rope finally grew still. Mara pulled. A figure crawled out of the white darkness on one arm and one knee. Harlan pushed himself upright. It will hold until morning. Mara looked past him at the storm still raging across the basin. Morning is enough. By the 4th morning, the wind had finally begun to weaken. No one celebrated. They simply started counting. Every Maine animal was still alive. The newborn calf carried only a small patch of frostbite on one ear. The bedding remained dry. Water still flowed through the trough. The hay crib showed no heat or spoilage. The barn doors opened without digging through snow. There was still firewood stacked beside the stove. Noah Pike stood on his own feet again. Harlan walked the ranch with a notebook instead of relief. One brace had been too light. 2 marker posts needed to be set deeper. The outer cloth strips would need stronger stitching. The wooden cover over the water coupling needed a better roof. Mara watched him writing. You've counted every weakness before you've counted what survived. Harlan closed the notebook. The living can wait an hour. He looked across the battered windbreak. A weakness should not be allowed to hide behind success. Later, the clouds opened just enough to reveal a strip of gray sky. Steam drifted from the cattle as they breathed into the cold air. The children have their milk, Mara said quietly. Harlan studied the broken section of the willow wall. The ranch still needs fixing. Neither of them spoke about spring. Neither of them spoke about leaving. That evening, Mara placed Harlan's dry gloves beside the 2 tin cups waiting near the stove. She set them there as naturally as though they had always belonged. When the roads finally opened, people came to Coldwater Reach for answers instead of rumors. Edwin March arrived first. Dr. Amos Keene followed. Then came neighboring ranchers who had spent 4 days digging cattle from snowdrifts. March inspected everything without hurry. He checked the barn temperature, felt the bedding with his bare hand, examined the water system, counted the surviving cattle, measured the remaining hay, and read every page of the ledger from the first 3 weeks before the storm to the last entry written during it. At last, he closed the book. The barn stayed drier. The herd burned less feed than expected. Stable water made the difference. The windbreak stood where the snow wanted to settle, not where the doors needed to open. And every flaw you found early was corrected before the blizzard arrived. Noah spoke next. I'd be dead if those marker posts hadn't been there. Silas Greeley came last. His ranch had lost cattle. Part of his north barn roof had been torn away. He offered no apology. Instead, he looked toward the willow wall. How far did you set it from the barn? 34 feet through the middle. Harlan answered. Then we adjusted for the ground, and you never weave it tight enough to stop the wind completely. Silas nodded once. Show me. Harlan walked beside him across the snow without another word. Later, after everyone had gone, Mara led Harlan into the ranch office. She placed a folded agreement on the desk. It granted him a share of the ranch's profits, authority over water systems, structural work, and winter preparation. One final line stood apart from the rest. Eli and Nell would always have a home at Coldwater Reach, regardless of what happened between the two adults. Harlan looked up. "Why would you give me part of something that has always belonged to you?" Mara met his eyes without hesitation. "I'm not giving you what was mine." She gently turned the agreement toward him. "I'm naming what you already carried." That evening, after the agreement had been signed, Harlan and Mara sat beside the stove while the ranch settled into its first quiet night since the blizzard. The fire burned low. Neither of them hurried to fill the silence. At last, Harlan looked into his cup. "I came here asking for milk." "I never meant to owe you a life." Mara rested both hands around her coffee. "You don't owe me one. But there is one here, if you mean to share it." Harlan smiled for the first time in months. "I'll stay until the snow is gone." Mara looked toward the window where patches of ice still clung to the fence. "Stay until the grass comes back." He lifted his eyes. "Longer than that." They didn't marry as soon as the roads reopened, as the work still came first. In the following weeks, they focused on rebuilding the broken windbreak. Under Harlan's guidance, neighboring ranches, even Silas Greeley, soon adopted the Coldwater winter plan. It wasn't until early May that Harlan and Mara held a quiet wedding, witnessed by Dr. Amos and Inspector March. The celebration lasted only long enough to sign the papers, as Maple was calving again. Silas never attended, but a neat bundle of straight willow stakes resting beside the fence served as a silent blessing. A few days later, Eli looked up from the ledger. "Do I have to call you something else now?" "You never have to call me anything you don't truly mean," Mara smiled. Eli nodded. Mara. For her, that was enough. But weeks later, after tripping near the marker posts, he blurted out, "Ma, Mara." She rushed over to brush the dirt from his hands, pretending not to hear the word he almost finished. Spring slowly returned. Beside the barn post where Eli had just carved a new snow line, little Nell took careful, unsteady steps toward Mara. "Ma," the tiny voice drifted across the yard. Mara didn't rush forward. She simply knelt, patiently waiting for the girl to finish the last few steps on her own. Harlan traced his eyes over the repaired windbreak, the open barn doors, and the grazing cattle. "And it still needs fixing." "That's a good thing," Mara replied, handing him the second tin cup. "You said you'd stay as long as there was work." Coldwater Reach didn't survive because winter showed mercy. Winter showed none. It survived because every weakness was fixed before the storm could exploit it. Harlan and Mara never rescued each other. They simply stopped mistaking loneliness for strength. And out here on the frontier, that lesson would endure far longer than any winter.